We're here to talk about your book, which is The Responsible Globalist. So give us a kind of summary of what success does look like then. I mean, you have an introduction and then you lay out kind of 6 key themes and you end up with pretty much a sort of plan of action.
That's right.
What is this wonderful globalized world that you're going to create for us? How does it work?
So what success looks like is that if you want institutions to function well at any level, in a business, in a country, and including globally, you need a community of trust underlying them. If you want your business to work well, you need people to feel like we're part of this team and we trust each other. And the same works for a country and the same works for the world. How do you create the myth of trust, the myth of belonging? That's what success looks like. And for me, what it looks like is a global nation. And the reason I use that is because the nation has been the most powerful myth of belonging we've ever created. Powerful enough to create just about enough trust between humans. Not perfect trust. People from London and people from Newcastle still think, oh, well, you're a northerner and I'm a southerner. But enough trust for democracy, for the welfare state, for other amazing benefits of the modern world to exist. And so that is what we're missing at a global level, that level of trust as humans, the idea that all lives have equal value. So the quest to success is, how do you build that?
Where I think it gets dangerous is when you stray into this kind of cultural stuff, basically. I think you would get quite a lot of support. There already is, as we see from these huge success of the latest climate movements. There is broad support for, collaborative international action on practical things, such as fixing Ebola, dealing with climate change. When you get to a cultural sphere, people get a lot more anxious. And this is where I wonder if it's a solvable...
What do you mean by cultural sphere?
This whole idea of feeling in the pit of your belly that you are a part of the global nation as opposed to part of the culture that you currently identify with, or as well as that starts... will raise hackles. There's one point where...
But you just presented it in 2 different ways and corrected yourself. And that's really instructive, because on the one hand, you presented it as an opposition between local identity and global identity. That's how it's often thought about. That's what people who want to destroy the global system claim, that it's either we're Americans or we're globalists, and if you believe in America, let's get rid of the global system. But then you corrected yourself to actually what I say, and I think demonstrate, there's good evidence here in terms of people who really are expert in how identity works, that says it doesn't work like that. It's that when we add a new layer of identity that's broader, it does not mean ditching. So, for example, Christians who believe that they're meaningfully part of the Christianity are not anti-British or whichever country they come from, as are Muslims not anti, whichever country they come from. Equally, people who are British still have their London and Newcastle and Liverpool identities. And furthermore, people who care about the world, as I do, care deeply about, for example, British politics. They vote in elections, they give to local charities. They're not disloyal to the nation state, as Theresa May implied when she said, if you think you're a citizen of the world, you're a citizen of nowhere. That's just simply not true. So I think culturally you're right. If we can avoid presenting it as a dichotomy, we'll be on surer ground. And that's absolutely in line with reality.
I completely accept your point. You can retain multiple identities, and people have always done that. What I'm suggesting, though, is the attempt to inculcate a mushy feeling of identity which doesn't exist at the moment. You talk about it's time for a new globalist credo. That is a religious term. You want global citizenship as core parts of school curricula. You suggest that countries who are serious about this agenda should demand that this thing called the world's largest lesson, which is a kind of globalist lesson, should be a compulsory part of their country's education. To a lot of people, this will sound like a kind of Maoist, top-down, slightly sinister thing, if you're trying to kind of teach people to love something that they don't naturally love.
Again, the idea that this is top-down, I would push back on. I think the institutions we have globally have been created top-down, in the sense that governments have met in a smoky or unsmoky room and agreed to them. There wasn't a referendum to see whether the UN should be brought in. There were polls which showed that 80% of Americans were supportive, interestingly, and it was a bipartisan issue. But it wasn't done that way. It was top-down. What I'm calling for is exactly the opposite. I'm not actually calling for governments who are serious about this to do X, Y, Z. I'm saying people who are serious about this should ask their government to ensure that the that curriculums in their country have elements of learning about the world. What I'm calling for is exactly the opposite of the top-down. Why doesn't it always happen top-down? Precisely because people don't care. Now, I'm insistent on keeping democracy as we try to unite as a world. So how do you solve the conundrum between keep democracy as we unite as a world and push for a more united world is actually convince the voters in the democracy that they should vote in that way. And if they don't agree with me, don't, and then they won't get the political outcomes. Now, one of the things that I want to push people to do...
Just to be clear, the top-down thing I feel we discussed already, and I completely understand that you don't think it is top-down.
And that's why it's not Maoist. Because Maoism was not implemented by a referendum. This is about saying, let's actually...
Who is the we that is doing this then? Who is the we who is trying to, leading this movement to persuade voters, to then persuade governments to include global citizenship lessons for all of their students? Who is the we?
The case I make is that because of changing technology and evolving threats like climate change, which we're increasingly aware about, there is a unique opportunity in the coming years to harness the opportunity people feel about being part of a world together in a nice fluffy way, and the fear they feel about threats like climate change against which we need to unite, to create a stronger human identity which would show up in more successful global institutions. We can all do it, and there are many organizations out there. I think some of the problem is we're not all pushing in the same direction. So, for example, many people who are trying to bring the world together are banging the drum of saying we need open borders. That's actually heading down a dead end for reasons that I suggest. Others who strongly believe they're globalist, The Economist is kind of the globalist newspaper par excellence, is always talking about the West as if it's an in-group. So they're not making the most of their voice in terms of being part of this. So I think, like the institutions already exist and need to function better, the civil society that could actually drive this change already exists, but it needs to have the right message.
Things like what you're talking about are already happening, and that in a sense we don't need to coordinate a new kind of sort of political credo around it, because it's organically happening anyway with the right leader such as Greta, the right issue, and suddenly people are doing it anyway. I mean, what needs to be done additionally to that?
So I think no political idea is worthwhile if it's in a context where it has no hope of succeeding. So it's great news that some of these things are starting to happen in some way, but no, it's not going to happen all on its own. Because right now we have a very polarized world. There's some people like Greta Thunberg who are bringing people together from all different nation states into a single movement, and you have other people who are actively campaigning against them. And the single most powerful person in the world stands up at the UN now for the second year in a row and denigrates globalism as some kind of plot against the nation state. Clearly, we need some way of undermining that. I think Greta Thunberg on her own is not going to do that, because we need something that can prove, not just, but including to the white working class voter in Europe and North America, that globalism can help them. That's what they don't have right now. And climate change right now hasn't broken through to enough of them as a rationale for action. That's why I talk a lot about tax, because right now I think the one of the most important things that's driving apathy with or hostility against the global system is the idea that it's for the minority to get rich, but actually I, as a voter in Ohio or Doncaster, now have an immigrant next door that doesn't speak my language, my job's gone to China, and you're telling me I can't tax Amazon. So it's lose, lose, lose. And if we can really demonstrate that actually this system is not just a great way of coming together to make money, but also to close tax loopholes and bring money home to Doncaster and Ohio, these are other elements. And so I do think bringing it together and saying, yes, it's climate change, but it's also tax fairness. And it's also not having immigration out of control, but allowing countries to control the pace of change. I think when you package it like that, Steve Bannon will never agree. But could you get fewer voters to support his kind of party over time? Unless we do that, we don't have a chance.
I think there's a structural problem with this kind of agenda in that most people have less resources than you do, and less time and less kind of ability to hold these complex concepts, and actually the appeal of a simpler identity is always going to win over, because it says, well, you know, when you're busy and you're struggling, it's easier to be one thing than to be three things or five things. And that's partly why the populist leaders have been successful. So I just wonder, you can be a responsible globalist, but can an entire population be
I'm so glad that you put up that straw man for me to destroy, because there is an argument that said yes, it's only the sophisticated people who are frankly intelligent and sophisticated enough to be globalists, or to care about all humanity and the rest of it. I think that's absolute nonsense. The truth is that we all, like it or not, sophisticated or unsophisticated, by whatever definition of sophistication, we all have many layers of identity. That's just how humans operate. In fact, only having one identity is the impossibility. We all care deeply about our family and care more deeply about our family than our neighbours. We all have some care for the 150 people that operate in a closer circle to us, and we all have some more imagined identities we fit into, whether it's our religion or our country and beyond. And very few of us want slavery, so for all of us, humanity has some meaning. It's simply not true that there are these kind of barbarians amongst us that are congenitally anti-globalist and for whom there is no hope. It's not true. The truth is, we experience immigration differently. Wealthier, more educated people experience immigration differently because our social networks are broader. It doesn't bother us as much that our neighbours don't speak English, because frankly our friends aren't probably likely to be our neighbours. It's people that we went to university with that live now in other cities. We have a broader network. We're less affected by immigration in a negative way. That's number one. Number two, we haven't been economically damaged by some of the things that have happened through the global economy over the last 10, 15 years. Our incomes have continued to rise and other people's haven't. So the idea that we get it and they don't get it is a very unhelpful and very common way of thinking about it, especially when it comes to the results of elections. It's just because half the country's racist that they voted for X, Y, Z. The truth is, there are real things we have to fix, and once we fix them for those people, we'll see that they actually care about all humans too.